Japan has a founding myth. Most countries do. In Japan's version, a god named Jimmu descends from the heavens, marches east across the islands, and establishes the imperial line. His reign is dated officially to 660 BC. The unbroken dynasty that follows him runs, in theory, all the way to the present day. That story is taught in Japanese schools. It is inscribed in the country's foundational text, and for most of the last 13 centuries, it has served as the official answer to the question, where did Japan come from? But here is something the Kojiki, Japan's own official mythology, admits on its own pages if you read carefully enough. Before Jimmu arrived in Yamato, there was already a god there, a heavenly god, a descendant of the same divine hierarchy as Jimmu, someone who had descended from the sky in what the text calls a heavenly rockboat and taken the land as his own. His name was Nigihayahi. The Kojiki does not hide this, it is right there in the text. A prior claimant of equal divine standing, already sitting in the territory that Jimmu was sent to conquer. Think about what that means for the founding story. If Jimmu is the first, the origin point, the one from whom everything flows, then who was Nigihayahi? The myth resolves this inconvenience quickly. Nigihayahi recognizes Jimmu's legitimacy, switches sides, and the problem is made to disappear. But you cannot unask the question, why was he there at all? We have spent 3 episodes watching Japan's official history paper over things that were inconvenient. A queen erased, a civilization turned into myth, a conquest rewritten as a gift. Now we are going to find out what was underneath all of it, what Japan looked like before anyone decided to write the history. Because to understand who Nigihayahi was, what he represented, what the people who protected him were fighting to preserve, you have to go back much further than any myth. You have to go back 13,000 years. 13,000 years. Before we can understand what Nigihayahi might have represented, what kind of world he belonged to, we need to understand what was actually here before the myths began. When most people picture ancient Japan before the arrival of farming, the image tends to be something like this: small bands of people moving through the forest, making rough pottery, surviving, primitive. That image is wrong. We know it is wrong because of what archaeologists have been pulling out of the ground for the last 30 years. The culture we are talking about is called the Jōmon. They take their name from the rope pattern pressed into their pottery. Jō meaning rope, mon meaning pattern. That pottery is, by some measures, among the oldest in the world. Current evidence places it approximately 16,500 years ago. The earliest pottery found in what is now Europe comes roughly 10,000 years later. The Jōmon were not farmers, not in the organized field clearing sense, but they were not nomads either. They settled, they stayed, and in some places they built things that should not have been possible for people we have been taught to call primitive. In 1992, construction workers in Aomori City were clearing land for a baseball stadium. Sound familiar? They found something. What came out of that ground is now called the Sanai Maruyama site, and it changed what scholars thought they knew about the Jōmon. The settlement had been continuously occupied for approximately 1,700 years. At its center was a structure that required explanation. 6 massive post holes arranged in 2 precise rows, spaced exactly 4.2 meters apart in both directions. That kind of precision is not accidental. It requires planning, measurement, and the sort of coordinated labor that does not happen in a casual camp of wanderers. The posts themselves, preserved in the damp soil, were chestnut logs, each roughly a meter in diameter. The structure they supported is estimated to have stood approximately 15 meters high. There is a word for the kind of society that builds 15-meter towers. That word is not primitive. Among the tens of thousands of artifacts recovered, lacquerware coated in urushi resin, tinted red with iron pigment, The process is not something you stumble into, it requires knowledge, refined over generations. There was jade traced to sources 500 kilometers south, amber, obsidian. This was a civilization embedded in a thread network that ran the length of Japan. And then there are the stone circles. The most famous are at Oyu in Akita Prefecture, 2 concentric rings of stone, built approximately 4,000 years ago. The larger circle is 48 meters across. At the center of each is a sundial-like structure, aligned to the winter solstice sunrise. The stones were carried 5 kilometers from a riverbed to build this. A society with no writing and no metal built a monument calibrated to the movement of the sun. Primitive was always the wrong word. So who were the Jōmon? Where did they come from? And what happened when their civilization, the one that built Sanai Maruyama, that carried stones 5 kilometers to align them with the winter sun, encountered the people who would eventually become the Yamato? For most of the 20th century, the standard answer was a simple 2-part story. The Jōmon were here first, the Yayoi arrived from the continent and brought farming. And over time, the two mixed. Modern Japanese people descended from both. That model has been revised. Significantly, in 2021, a research team from Kanazawa University, Trinity College Dublin, and several other institutions published an analysis of ancient Japanese genomes spanning 8,000 years of prehistory. Their conclusion was not a 2-part story, it was 3. The Jōmon, the first, had diverged from continental populations somewhere between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, when rising sea levels cut the Japanese archipelago off from the mainland. By any reasonable definition, they were indigenous. Then, approximately 3,000 years ago, a second wave arrived. People with Northeast Asian ancestry, most likely from the Korean peninsula, brought wet rice cultivation. This is the Yayoi period. Over generations, the newcomers and the Jōmon mixed. But then the study found something unexpected, a third component. During the Kofun period, roughly 1,700 years ago, the same era in which the Yamato court was consolidating power, there was a significant additional influx of East Asian ancestry. A different genetic signal, one that had not appeared in earlier models. The researchers called this finding unexpected. I want to be precise about what the science says and what it does not. This 3-wave model is the most detailed picture we currently have, but the debate continues. Research from the University of Tokyo, published in 2024, suggests the Yayoi and Kofun ancestry may have come from a single continuous source, the Korean peninsula, rather than 2 separate waves. The picture is still being refined. But one thing is not in dispute. Japan was not built by one people in one moment. The genome of a mainland Japanese person today is, on average, approximately 10 to 13% Jōmon. The rest arrived later. 10% is not nothing. And memory, unlike DNA, does not dilute so easily. The Yayoi did not arrive in an empty Japan. They arrived in a Japan that had been home to a living civilization for 13,000 years, and the people already here did not simply step aside. The archaeological record is not a story of replacement. In western Japan, where the Yayoi arrived first, skeletal remains from early sites show a population that was already partly Jōmon. There was mixing. People were not exterminated, they were absorbed, at least in places. In the north, particularly Hokkaido, Jōmon populations held on far longer, maintaining their own culture well into the historical period. The Ainu people, whose genetic profile remains significantly more Jōmon than mainland Japanese, are the most direct living evidence of that persistence. But this is where the story gets interesting, because the Kojiki, the official mythology of the winners, contains, buried inside its pages, what may be a memory of exactly this moment. The moment when the ancestors of the Yamato first pushed into land that was already occupied. The story is called the Jimmu Tosei, the Eastern Expedition of Emperor Jimmu. Most historians today regard Jimmu himself as mythological. His reign is dated to 660 BC, a number that was almost certainly calculated to impress the Chinese court rather than record any actual history. But the shape of the story is worth sitting with. Jimmu moves east from Kyushu, pushing toward the Yamato region, and he is stopped, not by a minor skirmish, by a man who defeats his army twice, who kills his older brother. His name is Nagasunehiko, the long-legged man, and Nagasunehiko is not fighting for himself. He is fighting for someone else, a figure he has pledged to protect, a god who had already arrived in Yamato before Jimmu got there. That god, the one Nagasunehiko spends his life defending, is Nigihayahi, the same Nigihayahi we started this episode with. And now the question we asked at the beginning has its answer, or rather, its shape. Here is what the Kojiki actually records. A divine figure of equal heavenly standing to Jimmu, already installed in Yamato, protected by a military force powerful enough to repel Jimmu's armies twice. That is not a myth about a peaceful founding. That is a myth about a hard-fought conquest and the people who stood in the way. The myth resolves this the only way it can. Nigihayahi somehow recognizes Jimmu's legitimacy and switches sides. He turns on Nagasunehiko, kills him in fact, and the problem is made to disappear. Whether you believe the mythological framing or not, notice what it required. The compilers of the Kojiki could not simply write Nigihayahi out. He was too embedded in the memory of the clans that traced their ancestry to him. They had to incorporate him, and incorporate him in a way that made him loyal to the Yamato in the end. Those clans were the Mononobe, one of the most powerful forces in early Japanese history. They would go on to be the last institutional defenders of the old religion, fighting against the introduction of Buddhism in the 6th century before being destroyed. The Mononobe's founding god was the one who was in Yamato before Jimmu arrived, and Nagasunehiko, the man who fought hardest to protect him, was their kind of warrior, someone who did not surrender until there was literally no one left to surrender to. Make of that what you will. Now I want to go further than what the ground can prove. This is my reading. You can disagree with it. The Kojiki refers to the period before the first emperors as Jindai, the age of the gods, Amaterasu in the heavens, Izanagi and Izanami shaping the islands, great cosmic dramas playing out before human time began. The compilers place this period outside of history entirely. Before memory, before record, before anything that could be questioned. But look at what that period actually contains: the creation of the land, the teaching of farming, medicine, metalworking, attributed not to the Yamato ancestors, but to Okuninushi, the god of Izumo, who we met in episode 3. And then the conflict, the Kuniuzuri, the peaceful transfer that we now know required a god to flee hundreds of miles and beg not to be killed. And underlying all of it, Nigihayahi, sitting in Yamato before anyone sent him there. My reading is this: the age of the gods is not a placeholder for empty prehistory. It is a mythologized encoding of something real, specifically of the long, slow, violent transition from the world of the Jōmon to the world of the Yamato, the civilizations that built Sanai Maruyama and aligned stone circles to the winter solstice were not erased overnight. They were absorbed over centuries, and the memory of the absorption, the memory of what was lost and who fought to preserve it, became what we now call mythology. In this reading, Okuninushi is a memory of the civilization that was already here. Nigihayahi is a memory of a kingdom that preceded the Yamato in Yamato itself, and Nagasunehiko, the man who kept fighting after everyone else stopped, is a memory of the people who refused, for as long as they could, to become someone else's founding myth. I want to be careful. This is a hypothesis, not a certainty. Scholars who study this period do not reach consensus on it. The mythology was compiled centuries after these events, if they happened at all, and certainty is probably impossible. But the alternative is stranger. The Kojiki describes in careful detail a civilization that taught Japan agriculture, medicine, and metalworking, and then tells us that civilization gave everything up willingly, and hid inside that same text a prior heavenly claimant who somehow does not challenge the founding story at all. We have seen in 3 episodes exactly how the victors write history. I don't think this is any different. Here is what we can say. For roughly 13,000 years before the Yamato court existed, Japan was home to a civilization. They made pottery among the oldest in the world. They built towers and stone circles aligned to the winter sun. They traded lacquerware and jade across the length of the archipelago. They were not primitive, they were a world. And that world did not simply end, it was absorbed gradually over centuries into something that replaced it and then called itself the beginning. Embedded in the myths of the people who replaced them is the memory of a god who was already there, a kingdom that came before, a warrior who fought to the end, and a founding story that, if you read it carefully, cannot quite manage to erase what it most needed to erase. The Jōmon left no written records. They left the ground. And the ground, as we have said before, does not lie. In the next episode, we follow Nigihayahi. We are going to look at what kind of kingdom he may have represented, who the Mononobe actually were, and what it meant for Japan, for the old religion, for everything the Jōmon had built, when that world finally ran out of people willing to defend it. Subscribe and I'll see you there.